Great, we can see your slides now.
Okay, is it full screen or does it have?
Not yet. You can click presenter mode and then it will go to full screen. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and nice to see a few familiar names. I see Dr. Davis, and appreciate the opportunity to present to the School of Medicine. My grandfather, Edgar I, graduated from medical school at the University of Maryland in 1925, around there. So we have to have some affiliation with the University of Maryland. So my talk today, I work with Steve Davis and Chrissy and Grazi on the KL2 program within the ICTR. And our goal is to help train the next generation of clinical investigators and create an opportunity for them, as well as provide infrastructure for them to do research and become the next generation of NIH researchers. So I'm happy to present some of the work that I've been doing personally, and also I'll try to weave in some of the training that's happened during some of our studies, and the types of opportunities and the types of studies that can be used for junior faculty or fellows or residents to capitalize on infrastructure studies to help build their own careers and start the pathway to promotion, et cetera. So I don't have any commercial interest or disclosures. I'm not disclosing any FDA-approved drugs. So the objective of this presentation is going to be talking about a very difficult thing that we all experience in clinic, is how do we get people to change their behaviors around lifestyle and diet. We know very well that much of the chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, cancers are related to, I'll call them, bad behaviors around diet and exercise. And so what I'd like to do is say how we have a responsibility to try to promote healthy diets and lifestyle approaches, but we also have a need to figure out ways where we can do it effectively, because we're all busy with medical advice and taking medications and such, but we have to figure out ways to help communicate the importance of it and increase knowledge and awareness and adaptation of healthy behaviors with our patients. So I'll talk about first, in order to give that type of advice, we have to know what diets to recommend, and we have to know something about those diets. We can't play lip service to adopt a Mediterranean diet, and our 5-second advice of that may not be effective. And so I wanted to show some evidence of work we've done at Hopkins on 4 studies where we've helped determine national recommendations for types of diets which help lower cardiovascular disease risk, using surrogates as the outcome, not outcomes of death, stroke, or cancer. Those take a long time to develop, but relying on surrogates like blood pressure, lipids, and glucose homeostasis. So as my career has gone through at Hopkins now for 30 years, I've gone from some of the earlier studies here, which look at clinical efficacy. You want to demonstrate that a diet, to use this example, is effective at lowering those risk factors or affecting those risk factors. But when you run through the translation pathway, this is the hard part. And I see Fadia might be on. How do we do dissemination and implementation of diets that are effective at reducing risk factors and get them into practice, and how do we get them into community? So I'll be talking the second half of the talk about some of our personal attempts to try to get food and nutrition and lifestyle changes into practice using some I think unique approaches. So I'm going to talk about 4 diets that were done at Johns Hopkins between 1997 and the last one was about 4 years ago published. And this is the DASH study, the Dietary Approach to Stop Hypertension. Luckily, I came in when I was a fellow and worked on this study, got on the authorship. There's the DASH sodium trial, OmniHeart study, and the OmniCarb study. And these are 4 seminal feeding studies that we did. And the DASH study. I'm hoping that most of the people on the call know what that is, have heard of it, and it's the dietary approach to stop hypertension. U.S. News and World Report ranked it as the best overall diet 8 straight years. Of course, I'm reporting this from several years ago because it's lost its hold on number 1. The Mediterranean diet has moved up the ladder. But nonetheless, the NHLBI and other groups, American Heart Association, hypertension groups recommend this approach to for blood pressure. So if you're in your clinic and you're giving the elevator speech about when to a patient, what's a healthy diet for them to try to adopt to help lower their blood pressure without starting a pill, the elevator speech is a diet that's high in fruits, vegetables, low-fat dairy. It includes whole grains, nuts, poultry, and fish, and it's reduced in fats, red meat, sweets, and sugar-containing beverages. And we also know from some of the work we've done here that that message seems very simple, but within 5 minutes of walking out of the clinic, that most of it will be forgotten, unfortunately. So, and just as a background on for those that aren't in nutritional research, just a reminder that all of our calories come from fats, protein, and carbohydrates. That equals 100% of our calories. And there are different qualities of fats, of course. Saturated fat, that's one that's a target for reduction, and polyunsaturated fats. And within the polyunsaturated fats, they can be modified to be stiffened, and for instance, trans fats, which are bad. Protein, our recommendations are vegetable-based protein or animal protein. Often animal protein has, as a rider with it, saturated fats. And then more recently is carbohydrate, complex carbohydrates versus with a high glycemic index or low glycemic index or high glycemic index carbohydrates. So good and bad carbohydrates. So that's just to break it down as a reminder, 100% of our calories coming from these macronutrients. And if I were to give a quiz on this in the room or in the general population, what diets have people heard about? And what's the macronutrient makeup of these diets? The macronutrient makeup is quite different. For instance, 20 years ago, and the cardiologist had heard about the Ornish diet, which is an extremely low-fat diet. This white bar here is the percent of calories from fat. His target was less than 10% fat. That means that there's a very high percentage of his carbohydrate and then 15 or 20% protein. So that's the one. I think he's still around promoting this diet too. And it showed evidence from trials that the Ornish diet did lower progression of atherosclerotic disease and events. And then there's the Atkins diet, which is sort of the opposite. You pile on the fat and the protein and very little carbohydrate. Here's just a small amount of carbohydrates, where carbohydrates are the enemy in this diet. And then there are the diets in between, the DASH diet, here's our modest contribution, the Omni diets, the Mediterranean diets. And so it's very confusing to consumers, what is the best diet when there's so many moving parts when describing diets. So the trials I'll be talking about, the four trials, the DASH sodium, Omni Heart, Omni Carb. These are diets that are studies that we did under ideal conditions of monitoring and compliance. They were randomized trials. These were adults not on any blood pressure medications or diabetes medications. We provided 100% of their food, and we didn't allow them to eat anything outside of what we gave them. Believe it or not, they were very adherent. Because they're relatively short, 8 weeks long. And it's isocaloric feeding. We know that losing weight or exercising lowers blood pressure. And so we kept that steady. We did isocaloric feeding, weighed people every day, adjusted their calories, keeping the macronutrients proportions the same if they did start losing weight or gaining weight. And then we also, in the DASH trial original, we fixed the sodium intake. We know that salt, we believe that salt affects blood pressure. So we kept the sodium level the same in the DASH study between the contrast diet. And the outcomes are surrogates are traditional CVD risk factors, blood pressure, lipids, markers of glucose homeostasis. And the DASH diet pattern here, in summary, is 7 to 8 servings of fruits and vegetables, if you add those up. A lot of servings of grains and non-fat dairy, some nuts. This is a typical daily serving. And here's what an entire day of the DASH diet looked like. This is an old picture, but this is what we took back then. And if you go through and add up the number of, for instance, of fruits and vegetables, you'll come up with 9. There's banana, there's carrots, there's fruit, there's stewed tomatoes, broccoli, etc. So there's salad. So it comes up to a high proportion, which is high in potassium, magnesium, micronutrients that might be beneficial at lowering blood pressure. And so here's I'm just going to give one slide on each, at least one slide on each study. So this is the impact of isocaloric feeding, no change in exercise, no change in weight, and no sodium contrast on blood pressure over time. It was a parallel design trial and 400 people. And you can see that the control diet thankfully maintained their blood pressure. So our contrast was good. And here's the DASH diet over time. And the salient points about the DASH diet are that the effect on blood pressure is quite fast. This is almost 9 millimeters and down to 11 millimeters reduction in blood pressure from baseline. This is the hypertensive subgroup, those not on meds. And also it's sustained and maybe even still heading south a little bit over that amount of time. So one question people often have, patients, is, well, do I have to do this for 3 or 6 months? No, the impact of diet is quite rapid. And it's within really the first few weeks, it can have a major impact on blood pressure. And I'll leave the DASH trial and go to the DASH sodium trial. So that DASH trial showed that that a good diet lowers blood pressure. And then we wanted to show what's the impact of a salt on blood pressure. So this was 400 people. I do need to mention there were 4 sites. We had a multi-center trial. It was Pennington in Louisiana, Duke, and Harvard and Hopkins. So those 4 sites, we split up about 100 per site. And in this one, we randomized to diet, the control diet or the DASH diet. And then that didn't change, but then we randomly assigned the 3 sodium levels, a low, intermediate, and high, in random order. So that was the randomization, was the order of the sodium. And they were assigned to one diet for the entire period. So what's a high salt diet was in this study, the average, similar to the average US intake of 3.2 grams of sodium per day. That's the typical US intake at the time. And what's recommended by the American Heart Association and other groups is 2.4 grams a day. There are some that are more militant about sodium, and like a Dr. Apple at Johns Hopkins said a low sodium of 1.5 would be a better target, which is near impossible with processed foods where sodium is built in quite a bit. And so here's the main slide from the DASH sodium trial. And this is the impact of sodium in a healthy diet, the DASH diet. So sodium reduction, this is in millimolars, so 140, 165 millimoles per day. And so you get a 3 millimeter increasing sodium, whereas if you're on a poor the typical American diet, the impact of sodium is much bigger, so 6.7 millimeters of mercury across the range of sodium versus the DASH diet, where it's less if you're eating a high potassium food with the DASH diet. And this is Stephen Jershek. I'll talk about him a little later. He's one of the chief program scholars who's now up at Harvard. He has a faculty appointment up there and a K-23, where he looked at the impact of the diet and sustainability over time, since there were 3 periods where the sodium level changed, but it looked at the blood pressure effect over the 12-week period. And once again, you can see that the blood pressure impact is at 4 weeks or so, and it's sustained after that. So 2 other studies I'll talk about, which once again set the standard for what diets should we recommend. The endocrinologists, probably like Dr. Davis here, said, well, wait a minute, this DASH diet is very high it's in carbohydrate. The DASH diet is 55% carbohydrate, 15% protein, or 18%, and 27% fat. So it's a low fat diet compared to typical American, very high in carbohydrate. And so a lot of the glucose or diabetes people didn't like this, because carbohydrates are the enemy in people with diabetes and high glycemic index, carbohydrates in particular. So the Omni Heart study that we did, where we replaced 10% of the carbohydrate, which was 58% in the DASH diet, and 10% was replaced with either protein, or 10% replaced with fat, unsaturated fat, so the good fats. And the cholesterol level intake was kept the same, and fiber was kept the same, to try to keep those in the same. And also, once again, no change in exercise in this study, and the sodium level was fixed as well. So here's the results of the blood pressure. And if we look at the hypertensive subgroup, the delta here is from baseline is a 13 millimeters, 16, 15 millimeters reduction from baseline. This study was powered to detect a difference of 1.5 millimeters, and it did achieve it. The protein diet compared to the carb was a winner, but there's really not a lot of difference here between these 3 healthy diets, the DASH diet essentially, and then replacement of protein or fat within that diet didn't have a very large impact. And the lipid effects were very similar across diets as well. I don't show those. So the last in the series is looking at the effect of the quality of carbohydrates that are eaten, impact on blood pressure, glucose, and lipids. And so in this Omni Carb study, it was published in JAMA, I think 4 or 5 years ago now. It looked at the impact of glycemic index, a difference of 66 versus 41. So a low GI index, glycemic index foods are whole grains, and they're unprocessed rice, whereas a high glycemic index of reference is 1 of 100 would be the amount of insulin and glucose that is released after eating 1 piece of white bread, or eating a certain fixed amount of sugar, table sugar. So the glycemic index is whether it's a simple or complex carbohydrate. So the contrast here was a very low or complex carbohydrate diet versus higher, not extremely high, and then the carbohydrate quality was the main contrast in this. So high carb, low carb, and then low glycemic index, high glycemic index. And the carbohydrate difference was 58% versus 41% in the 2 diets. And here it is again. This is also another 6-week feeding study where there were crossover, and the systolic blood pressure at baseline, 132 millimeters of mercury, and the change in blood pressure was the same across all diets. High and low glycemic index, high and low carb, very little difference, and the same for LDL cholesterol. Not a lot of difference, but very large effect and impact in reduction from baseline. So these studies, the takeaway of these feeding trials are that healthy diets work, of course, at reducing risk factors, and variations of the diet work equally well, approximately, on blood pressure. And the magnitude effects are very similar, and based on just consumption of an isocaloric, healthy diet. And so how good are we in terms of translating these efficacy studies in real life? And so relying on physicians in clinic to give this message about diet and how to sustain it, as we know from behavioral medicine people, that it's very difficult without support to get changes. And there are a lot of some difficulties related to cost in terms of sustainability and staffing and such. And the long-term effectiveness of clinical outcomes of dietary interventions have been shown in the DPP study, somewhat in the Look Ahead study, but they're not rock solid at 5 or 6 year, 8 years out. And so, and there are also important things that have shown the impact of acceptability and adherence to diets, and these are some of the social determinants of health, sociodemographic characteristics, and then the availability of healthy foods. Healthy foods are expensive, so their cost. So the guiding principles for the next line of work that we were doing is looking at ways to translate these efficacy studies into practical approaches to improve adoption of healthier diets. So we wanted our principles were keep it practical, keep it a low cost, and keep the interventions simple. And so just to look at how good have we been at changing behaviors around macronutrients over time. And what you can see here from a study in 2019, this is NHANES cross-sectional studies over time. The impact of any dietary advice we give on total carbohydrates has really been minimal, 3% to 51%. There've been really no change or impact of health messages. Total fat hasn't changed, 32% to 34%, something like that. There's no change in behaviors around macronutrients, although those are hard to describe because you're not telling them to adopt an Ornish diet and to eliminate fat from their diet. That's just not the messages we give people. So macronutrients are really unchanged over the last 20 years or so. And what about the quality of carbohydrates? Some of those messages are getting out. And we know simple carbohydrates like sugar and fructose and are somewhat getting out. There may be a slight downturn from NHANES on the consumption of low quality carbohydrates, but not much of an impact, but maybe there's a slight bending of the curve here that's possibly seen. So what about people or patients' awareness of different diets and what's healthy and what's not? Where do they get their information from? And people, when they're asked about that level of awareness regarding select diets in the United States, you can see that one of the big losers is, in spite of us being very happy about the DASH diet, only 1% of people know what the DASH diet is in this cross-sectional survey. View us very unfortunate. But things that advertise heavily, Weight Watchers, Atkins, Mediterranean is in the news. There's some awareness of those things, but once again, diet and diet messages are difficult to share and to have people assimilate them. And yeah, here's our 1%. So that's bad news for us in doing research. And I'm sure everybody in this room in medicine hopefully knows about the DASH diet. So, and what about some confounders in terms of awareness? One of the important social determinants of healthy diets is income, essentially. So this was a study just published looking once again at NHANES and stratified by SNAP recipients here and higher income adults. So the SNAP program is the old food stamp program, and it's a government subsidy for people in poverty. And the current distribution is about, I think it's $31 or $32 per person in the household if in poverty. And So if you look at SNAP recipients over time, are they improving, getting close to an ideal diet, way under 1%, going up to 1%? Even in those higher income people, adoption of an ideal diet is the uptake is not much. It's like 2.5% of the US population or adults eat an ideal diet, what's considered an ideal diet. But here, the concerning part is here, a poor diet is fairly unchanged over time in those that are SNAP recipients, where perhaps in those that have higher income, those that eat a poor diet by the FFQ in the NHANES study may be going down in those that people have more resources and higher income. So we did an editorial to that article looking at disparities in diet quality, no snappy solutions. That was our clever, this is Dr. Cruz, Deidre Cruz. She's a nephrologist, a former KL2, and now professor of medicine at Hopkins and doing research in diet. And the SNAP program, which gives money to purchase foods, doesn't have restrictions on what people buy, aside from you can't buy alcohol, tobacco, or cosmetics, but otherwise everything else is on the table because, as we point out in this article, there have been attempts to limit what people can buy with food stamps or SNAP distribution, but it's thought to be too paternalistic for somebody to say you can't buy this or you can buy that. You can only buy these types of foods. So those multiple times they've tried to put restrictions on purchases like sugar sweetened beverages and such, and have been unsuccessful at putting limits on what that money is used for. And so this came out in the Annals just a few months ago, looking at the impact of food security on achieving dietary changes. And this was a cluster randomized trial in Louisiana in clinics that are in generally poorer areas in the country. And they looked at whether or not an intervention with health coaches, and which were initially weekly versus a usual care, had an impact on weight in people that were overweight and had some other condition like hypertension or diabetes. And so 18 clinics participated, and this figure stratifies based on food security or food insecurity. And what constitutes food security is you have access to grocery stores with lots of food and healthy foods. And you have resources, money to buy what you want. So that was the food secure group. And the food insecure, their money, their resource issues in buying healthy foods or foods that would be advised by the health coaches. And so if you look at the impact, this is common to many studies that try to go out beyond a year or two. In the food secure group here, you get, and this is change in weight, the usual care. This is you in your clinic giving usual care to your obese patients. We're not so good at it. Now, if you were able to easily refer them to a health coach and they had follow-up, this is the impact on weight over 6 months, 12 months, 18 and 24. So looking at the secure group, usual care, that's us physicians trying to give advice, versus a health coach, there's a good change and somewhat sustained over 2 years in those that are secure. The health insecure, there is less of a reduction and there's more recidivism, likely because of the barriers that I've just mentioned, of access and money to purchase, and perhaps education, understanding what the health coaches are how they're presenting the information. So that's one of the problems. So what we decided to do before this article came out was to take one approach with our next set of studies, 3 of them I'll be presenting quickly, is to look at the food the SNAP program and see whether limiting what people can buy with the equivalent of a SNAP distribution amount of money can help change cardiovascular disease risk factors. So this is called the SNAP challenge, and a lot of people have been very interested in this. Cory Booker, who used to be the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, who's a vegetarian as well, he took this SNAP challenge. Some movie stars, I forget which ones they are, but they took on this challenge, and then there's even websites. If you are, and what they said, if you're a person who gets $30 a week for foods, can you eat a healthy diet that's going to sustain you, have adequate calories to sustain you, but also is healthy? And so this is what the purchase would look like for $30 a week. So $120 for the month. For $120, you can buy this much stuff. 5 pounds of potatoes, 2 dozen eggs, etc., oatmeal, celery, raisins. And if you purchase that, they were able to eat a healthy diet. And so it's possible, is their point, of these types of SNAP challenges. I went to the market across the street where I am. I know you have the Lexington, we have the Northeast market, and I grabbed these. This was $16 for that, so I couldn't do it myself probably. And so one of the opportunities we had was working with Dr. Lisa Cooper. She's somebody who works a lot on health disparities, and set up a health equity center. And here at Hopkins, it's been building and growing over time. And she got a P50 grant, which is a center grant that funded 3 projects within it, 3 trials. And so I got one of those with her. And we did a study that we called the 5+ nuts and beans trial. And so 5+ means 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, plus nuts and beans. That was our catchy acronym. It's always hard with trials to come up with something that reflects your study and your intervention and outcome. So we called it the 5+ nuts and beans trial, and we published it a few years ago. And the background is, once again, blood pressure, extraordinarily common, suboptimal diets contribute, social determinants are important, and particularly related to fruits and vegetables, low intake, which has, along with it, micronutrients are low, potassium and magnesium, for example, and sodium may be high. So, so we started off by going down to East Baltimore Medical Center, which is right by 83, near somewhere between Maryland and Hopkins. There's it's now owned by the Baltimore Medical System. Tiffany Gary here, who was a trainee here at the Welsh Center, she went down and did a survey of using a food frequency questionnaire of looking at the number of servings of fruits and vegetables people eat and self-report. And it's in this survey of East Baltimore Medical Center patients, there were 3.3 servings per day reported. And those that eat at least one meal out of their home a day, which is a lot of people, it was 2.5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. What's recommended DASH diet is 8 to 9. And potassium in the DASH diet is 4.7 grams a day, just from fruits and vegetables. So eating half that amount. And Tiffany since has gone up to University of Pittsburgh, and she's on the faculty up there in the School of Public Health. So another one of our students here looked at geomapping and wanted to look at the impact of availability of foods on diabetes and risk of diabetes and hypertension. And he went out and surveyed all these food stores in this geographic area. This is Baltimore proper here. And the white here is primarily African-American communities, and the dark is the white communities. Large circles are large stores like Giant or Weiss or any of those highly stocked stores. And these small dots are the small corner stores that we see all throughout the city. And so this is related to access, where in the predominantly white communities where there's no transportation issues, that people are driving and such to get healthy foods, where maybe these corner stores provide access for those that don't maintain a car and have more localized access. And so we did our study down in at EBMC. Here's a typical market, a corner store market. It sells meats and vegetables and cigarettes and other things that are unhealthy as well. And the population where we worked was 97% African American, and 59% had an income less than $25K per year. And the education, no further education behind, with a high school diploma only 35%, and about 50% at the time were unemployed, self-reporting. So our study design was to a two-arm parallel study. People with hypertension identified through the electronic medical record invited to participate. The control group would get a printed DASH diet advice plus money. We would talk about the DASH diet as we might do in clinic and give them money to purchase foods, as long as we could capture their receipts and see what they bought. And the DASH Plus got dietitian delivered DASH advice tailored to the neighborhood, and provision of $30 of groceries per week that were limited what they could purchase. We partnered with we partnered with a store, Santoni's. I don't have it here right now, but Santoni's Market, so we could limit what people purchased to 60 different types of foods. It was fruits, all the healthy stuff you can think of, but not the 5,000 foods that they had on their website, but just 60. And they got it, participants got advice on how to prepare foods that were healthy with that limit, and they were delivered to the library on Orleans Street, the Enoch Pratt Library. So this was a parallel design trial, and inclusion were hypertension on stable dose of medications, and exclusion were use of insulin or self-reporting heavy alcohol use. And here's the interventions. The target for purchasing was 17,000 milligrams per week of potassium in the supplemented food. So we totaled it up. And the activities were dietitian developed consultation, weekly calls, and helping with ordering foods. Primary outcome was blood pressure change, but also effects on potassium excretion, sodium excretion, glucose lipids, and vegetable consumption. So this is the follow-up, was over 8 weeks. And we even put in a preparation for transition to independence toward the end. So this is what 5 servings of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and beans might look like. That's peanut butter and some almonds and different vegetables, stewed tomatoes, peaches, and such. And so they're shown examples of how they could get in 5 servings of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and beans per week. And here's the Santoni's store that was our partner. So Santoni's would deliver to the library individually packaged foods for each participant. And this is some of our staff members, Deborah Gales here, and so they would come to the library and deliver on Tuesdays, I believe it was. And there was at the time in Maryland, the virtual supermarket, we partnered with them. They were trying to provide better access, so we partnered with them in the library. So this is some of the foods that people could buy. As you see, avocado, collard greens, potatoes, yams, kale, spinach, tomatoes, beans, peas, etc., carrots, and they could order these foods and not the other stuff. So how did we do this? We had a spreadsheet So the target was 17,000 milligrams of potassium. And so we had the food characterized, the amount of potassium in the foods, and we also had the price per package. So we got to $30, and we wanted them over 17 milligrams per week, spread out over the week in the foods that they purchased. So this person got black-eyed peas and kale, 1 package of kale, 1 package of spinach, 2 of carrots, 1 of peas, and 2 of red kidney beans, and 2 of peanut butter. So that's an example. And baseline characteristics, they were average age was around 60, 58 years of age. And they're in the neighborhood that I described earlier. So how did we do in terms of getting people to purchase versus self-reported consumption? This was the purchases potassium milligrams per week, and this is what they said they ate. So it was pretty good in terms of the integrity of the intervention. People did say they were eating what we gave them. How about the DASH control group? This group, we gave them the DASH brochure, and we gave them $150 for the first 5 weeks, and then another $90 for the next 3 weeks to get them to come in. So here's an example of a receipt that somebody spent their $150 on here, and they start out pretty well, green beans and strawberries and cherries, but then the wheels sort of fell off here, where there was Pepsi, Hebrew National hot dogs, 4 packages of bacon, Gatorade, corn syrup. So with a little advice and money, it ended up not being a very healthy diet. So we had another trainee from NCA&T. She was up from North Carolina for the summer, a trainee, and she took the receipts and characterized what people in the control group ate. And as you can see, they weren't achieving our 5+ nuts and beans objective. A lot of sugar sweetened beverages, 25% of the money, sweets, high salt meats, juice drinks, which are sugary as well, and only about 18 and 20% on fruits and vegetables of the money. So what are the impact on servings of fruits and vegetables? The baseline was 3.4, and the control group went up a little bit. They went up 1 serving per day about, and the DASH Plus went up 2.5 servings. So the comparison, people ate more fruits and vegetables. The potassium from the FFQ was increased, and magnesium was increased, and fiber went up as well. So provision of foods, limiting what people can purchase, did seem to help with advice. Some of the changes in the urine markers, so urine potassium to creatinine ratio went up, so that would suggest that the intervention worked. And we did have a reduction in albumin to creatinine ratio. We had about 30% who had microalbuminuria, and urine sodium excretion, even though that wasn't a target of our therapy, of our approach, people were replacing perhaps some of processed foods with the fresh foods. And the effects on blood pressure, this was a learning experience for me. When you have a group of people on blood pressure medications, even in an 8-week period, we found about 25% of people either stopped taking meds or changed the med or ran out or were taking medications that affect blood pressure. So we didn't see any effect on blood pressure, lipids, or weight, but we did see effects on the other surrogates and markers of good adherence. So so provision of foods that are healthy, limiting what people can eat, and with some support, increase self-reported consumption, and urine markers of improved diet, no effects on blood pressure. So another study we just completed, just published last month, it looked at the effect of DASH dietary pattern using this approach in people with hyperuricemia and gout. And this is our ProHealth Clinical Research Center. It's out in Woodlawn. And this entire center is set up only for doing clinical research. We don't do patient care out here. It's 2 stories. The bottom story is for measurement. The upper story, we have a metabolic kitchen and dietitians. And this was our team for DIGO. I got the funding, but here's Dr. Tershek again before he left for Boston. And we're actually after he left, he came back. He's the one that kept the motor running on the trial over time. And then we have others that are here. She's now in a PhD program who get training. And here's our dietitians and part of the team that we work with. So this study looked at the impact of a DASH diet on uric acid was the primary outcome in people with hyperuricemia and self-reported gout. We had published some earlier studies looking at sub-studies of the DASH trial that showed that uric acid was reduced with consumption of the DASH diet. And in this study, we used a $105 per week purchase of DASH foods, trying to give people enough food on a weekly basis to be able to meet their caloric needs with that much money in order to look at the impact on uric acid and other traditional cardiovascular risk factors. So it's a crossover trial, 4 weeks feeding, and then 4 weeks usual. By the way, never do a crossover study with a behavioral intervention. So that part didn't work out beautifully, but we used Amazon Fresh for this intervention rather than partnering with Santoni's, which had gone out of market, the supermarket. So this turned out to be quite nice because they would deliver individually packaged food for each participant, and then they would be open and the dietitians would check to make sure that they had what they had ordered, and they ordered with the dietitian. And average age was around 60, and blood pressure was low, 120, 124 millimeters of mercury, and they all had hyperuricemia or gout. So the impact of uric acid was nominal. First period effect was 0.5 milligrams per deciliter, and but as with the behavioral change that might occur once they're in a study, it was not sustained in the crossover. But impact on cholesterol, milligrams per deciliter, was close to significant. Glucose, fasting glucose, was reduced significantly. Self-reported fat, cholesterol, et cetera, self-reported servings of fruits and vegetables per day went up. Spot urine sodium went down, and the sodium potassium ratio was also affected favorably. So in this study, provision of foods to cover with limited counseling seemed to be effective on cardiovascular disease risk factors. And finally, our last study that we're doing now, once again, here's Dr. Cruz. It's called the 5 plus nuts and beans for kidney. It's people with who have chronic kidney disease defined by albuminuria. The primary outcome will be effect on blood pressure and albumin excretion. And we do take trainees in. We're just coming to the end of recruitment of that, and it's a one-year follow-up. And so this was last year's, for the last 2 years, group of people that helped us. They're great. And this is Taya. She just started medical school at Howard last month, and Chasm just started medical school at the University of Pittsburgh last month. And Rohan, he was at Minnesota, took a gap year, came here and trained with us, and he's now started residency here at Hopkins this year. So it's a good training ground for people who are interested in nutrition, and you also get a lot of good work out of trainees who are highly motivated and smart people. So in conclusion, the research that we've been doing, healthy diets work. We know that from the efficacy studies. Still a lot of work to do. And I know Fadia's on the call. I think she's doing dissemination implementation work. I'm hoping you'll do some work at Maryland on how to effectively communicate diet and impact of diet and how to get people to change behaviors around that. And it might be improving the food environment and also changing people's behaviors and knowledge and awareness around food selection. So, and of course, with any research that's done, it's interdisciplinary. You really need a team to do randomized trials, and you have to have good and hardworking people, dietitians, data collectors, data management people, and investigators all working together, and trainees to make it work. So I want to acknowledge that the importance of that and in terms of success. So I'll stop sharing. I think that's my last one.
That was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. You've got lots of questions in the Q&A box that I can read off,
Sure.
as well as in the chat box. One viewer asks, did you look at changes in gut microbiome? There's a lot of interest in how diet changes the microbiome, and some clinicians appear to be using it as evidence to show patients who are obese that changes in their diet are having an impact.
That's a good question. And the microbiome is a large interest in changing the microbiome through proteomics or through probiotics, and is once again marketed a lot. And it does seem that the microbiome may be important with blood pressure. We have a study, another trainee has pulled the DASH specimens and is looking at in metabolomics, looking at the microbiome, and to see whether the diets impact that. It does appear that way, but then you have to try to link it to, you know, what is the active player in that? There's so many. This is like looking at a shotgun pattern in terms of the number of, in terms of the metabolomic approach. I don't fully understand. I appreciate it. I think in my mind, sir, the microbiome evidence and the recommendations focused on microbiome might be a motivating factor for people, but I think the cart's before the horse a little bit on that. So but the jury's still out on that, I think. But for me, but that doesn't mean others on the call might know more.
Great. And have you thought about any policy implications of your work, perhaps changes in SNAP or others?
Yes, I think that would be, I think it would have to be done with resources. As I mentioned, it's been through Congress several times, and it's thought to be paternalistic. You can't tell people what to do and how to spend their money. You can't put limits on it. I think it would be, if there are resources provided, for instance, like our dietitian who helps people buy foods, or they've done like SNAP Plus, where people get bonus money if they buy fruits and vegetables versus things like SK bacon and hot dogs and things, where they would not get additional money for unhealthy purchases. So there's still some talk about that. There was a talk about the harvest basket, which would be turned during times of plenty, like now with the crops coming in, where there are a large availability, would be to try to make those available so people can buy double their $30 of fruits, vegetables. Would also favorably affect the farmers who are trying to sort of, you know, if they have crops, there are too many, they're trying to unload them. So this would be potentially beneficial for farmers as well. So, but it's tough. Yeah, I'm looking for any suggestions, if anyone. That's, yeah.
Similar question, or at least piggybacking off of vegetables and fruits. Irene writes, $30 per week will not get you organic dairy, vegetables, fruits. In other words, is it still a healthy diet if it contains antibiotic, pesticide, growth hormones? Okay,
this in terms of, the organic branding, it is more expensive because they can't use pesticides and herbicides and such. There are restrictions on what you can say is organic. And in my mind, our minds in general, pesticides and herbicides and such are, or GMO genetically modified aren't, it's how agriculture is kept alive. And so you can have products on a large scale. The FDA and EPA, they keep track of sort of levels that may be carcinogenic, et cetera. So I hate to say this, but we may have to trust our government on that. So I don't think we want to say you need to buy organic because of the sort of loose association evidence. We want to focus on getting the foods, and if they're if they're using common agricultural practices with herbicide, pesticides that are safe, I don't want to dissuade people or suggest that people need to buy organic, because that's going to double the price of what they buy. With this is adding another layer of maybe this would help long term in terms of an exposure to a pesticide, but the levels are very low in fruits in general. So, but it gets political as well. But yeah, the organic is a branding that people prefer, of course, but it's going to double the price, and the risk is not. I don't want to disseminate that it's not healthy it's not healthy to eat non-organic foods. I think that's my message on that.
Okay, and we have time for one last question. Do you have any information about the child development account or universal basic income studies about the impact on diet?
What is it, like the WIC program? Are you talking about
I think they mean, has there been any impact on diet when people are given like the universal basic income, or if they have, at least the way I'm interpreting this, like universal pre-K, as they're educated differently, do they have a different impact on diet?
Yeah, I think some of those earlier slides suggested that. Of course, that wasn't perfectly designed. It's an end-hand cross-sectional education, and certainly it may improve understanding and awareness, et cetera. But as far as behavior change, that's difficult. As far as with children, really for people up to the age of 16 or so, probably, people eat what they're provided in their homes. So it's educating the parents is important in order to, that the purchases and the food provision is is safe and healthy for the children as well. I didn't answer that question entirely, but
no, I think you did a great job. And there's a lot more questions, which I think speaks to how informative this lecture was and how interested people are in this research topic. So thank you so much again for your very interesting presentation. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much, Danica.
Take care.
Yep, bye-bye.